Hello, and welcome to the third panel of the day four, the Black Cat Comics Rocky Milpitas pre-Comic-Con Comic-Con. We've done panel number one was our Getting Into Comics. Panel number two was Collecting Vintage Comics. And we're rounding out our panel day with Superheroes Unleashed, Society and Our Need to Be Saved. Big topic. We're wondering, why are superheroes always so popular? Why do people love superheroes so much decade after decade? Why do they resurface at times of national, international crisis? What is it about comics that draws us in through the decades, in and out? It's a big topic. It's a lot to talk about. I think it's something that covers things a lot of people think about when they think about the popularity of the movies and the video games, the popularity. Adam West passed, and I think it reminded everybody what a touchstone Batman is through all the different generations and on and on. So we wanted to dig into that and see what that was all about. And so once again with me is Francis Soido, co-founder of Black Cat Comics. So to get a little bit of perspective from everyone, what is it about superheroes? Why do we latch on to this?
It's a fascinating topic. You know, why are we drawn to the capes, you know, decade after decade, generation after generation? You can kind of understand the birth of the superhero when you're thrusted into World War II, which is where they came out of. But why in the 80s? Why in the 90s? Like, what is it about our culture that we're constantly looking for a superhero?
I think initially, as you really get into what comics are, I think it's a big part about, obviously there's hero association. The superheroes is always the big thing. But when you look across the board into horror comics and science fiction and romance books, and the one thing that all genres of comics have in common is this idea that the character represents the reader. I think in movies and in almost any kind of entertainment, you, the reader, are meant to be symbolic of what's happening in the story. And then the stories of comics reflect what's going on to that reader and or that writer by default. I think those characters, whether you're talking about, again, James Bond, Superman, or the guy whose town is being invaded by Martians, they're just a person that is having this thing that society fears happening to them. And so through the decades, those comics reflect that. Like I said, World War II is a good example. I go back to the Golden Age. When you look at the origin of Superman in the first Batman comics and the first Wonder Woman comics, you have this sort of idealized situation where all three of them, Bruce Wayne is rich, Bruce Wayne is all these things, but at the end of the day, he's just a regular guy who has crime happen to him. And crime is something that can happen to anybody. And how he responds to that crime is the story of Bruce Wayne and the story of Batman. Superman gets rocketed to Earth. He's like any immigrant. He's put on a ship and he gets off the ship and here he is. So he is subjected to all of the societal norms of the place he shows up in. Whether you're superpowered or not, organized crime exists. Government regulation exists, all these things, and that's what Superman was about in the Golden Age. Wonder Woman is this idealized female, and who is put in a man's world. So no matter how powerful she is or whatever she can do, she's still subjected to the idea that she is one woman in a world run by men. And again, the comics of the first 10, 20 years sort of reflect that struggle. And it's interesting. It's because we still have these same characters today. Yeah. They've lasted all this time.
It reminds me of the Joseph Campbell, the hero story, which everyone knows now is famous for kind of where George Lucas got his idea for Star Wars. And I think it's true for superheroes as well. So the hero's journey is basically an ordinary individual who's thrust into extraordinary circumstances. And in doing so, they have a choice which is to kind of cower and maybe retreat, or to stand up to those extraordinary times and become extraordinary themselves. I think we all go through something like that, where we're kind of pushed to our limits, where we don't think we have anything more to give. We don't think we can take anything more. And we find some 10% somewhere reserves that we have, and we kind of move forward and get through it. So I think superheroes are a lot like that. It's something where they're beaten down, they're facing adversity, and instead of cowering or running away or turning the other side and taking off, they stay there and they dig in their heels and they get the job done.
That's super true. And I think that is reflected in, again, so many characters throughout the different eras, the different genres, whatever. As you say that, I think of everybody from Sergeant Rock to, you mentioned George Lucas, I think of everybody from Sergeant Rock to Luke Skywalker is that person in comics and in fiction. Certainly in the 60s, but to continue in a timeline, like say that sort of thing is reflected again in the 50s comics and in the World War II stuff. War comics is certainly that. Every war comic is about a group of regular guys, regular soldiers sent over somewhere, and these events happen to them. Or in the sci-fi comics where it's just regular people at the grocery store, and then the Martians invade. And the romance comics are the same kind of thing. It's just, you know, Billy and Jane, and then, you know, Billy turns out to be a jerk, and Jane's life is ruined forever. It's all, like you say, the regular person struggle, but it's comics, and so you have to make it entertaining, and you have to make it big, and all like that.
And I think the appeal isn't necessarily the superhero powers. It's not the mutant powers. The appeal, kind of like Peter Parker, it's that what do you find relatable with these characters, you know? So you might be a fan of Captain America. Is it because of his strength, or is it because you relate to being kind of picked on and smaller and maybe bullied when you were a kid? And how did he rose above that? And has these values of sticking up for and fighting for the little guy. Like, is that something that you relate to, you respond to? Like, what is it about you that feels compelled to follow Captain America? Like, for me, I'm a huge Batman fan. I've always been a huge Batman fan. Superman just never really kind of resonated with me. And looking at myself, you know, why is that? Superman to me is, he's got superpowers and is kind of put in these extraordinary circumstances, but he's different. Like, I can't relate to an alien being born with certain powers, right? Other people can. Batman to me, because he doesn't have any superpowers, he's super rich, that's maybe a superpower. But aside from that, he's just human. He can get hit by a bullet, he can get stabbed by a knife, he can get run over by a train, just like you and me. What makes him extraordinary is he has pushed himself to limits of self-discipline, of standing up and fighting crime, and always doing the best thing, the right thing, the righteous thing to do, despite tremendous adversity. You know, despite the Joker killing his, you know, one of his Robins, despite the Joker maiming Barbara. Like, he's up against kind of real life supervillains. We've all seen in the news these people that do horrible atrocities to family members, right? What does that family do? They want to seek vengeance. What would Batman do? Well, Batman would tie him up and put him in a bow for Gotham City. So we kind of, each one of us relates to different characters, I think, because we find something in ourselves that's familiar.
Super true. I think that's always been the appeal of characters like Peter Parker, like you mentioned. I think Peter Parker is a great example of a lot of these things, and I don't want to give anything away from the movie for people that haven't seen it, but it's in the book, it's in the movie, it's just as much about his struggle against the villains in society and all these things. It's terrible to be Peter Parker, and it's not always even that great to be Spider-Man either. And we put ourselves in that place, and we relate to that because our lives feel that way a lot of the time. And I again, it's a theme that comes up through the different things. I think about 80s comics and fear of government. Well, I guess it starts in the 70s. with Green Arrow, Green Lantern, Green Arrow comics, and political unrest of Watergate and Vietnam, whatever. And then this sort of fear of government comics began. And you see that pretty prevalently through the 80s with Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns. And in Spawn, you have, you know, government black ops. The 90s comics are full of black ops teams and government assassins and things like that. And again, it sort of reflects our view of society, reflects how we think things go on in the world. And it's interesting to me. I don't know how big and how small they get in the way that, like I say, whether it's fear of government, fear of the 60s was fear of radiation. Everything in Marvel Comics was, you know, the bomb was going to go and we were all going to die, or we were all going to turn into the Hulk or something. And in the 2000s, getting a little bit into the resurgence thing, there's a very clear point. Amazing Spider-Man 36 is the 9/11 issue. And there's a very clear point in 2001 where comic sales spike like crazy, and everybody went out and bought that issue of Amazing Spider-Man and kept buying comics. And I've found that interesting for a long time. Being a fan of comics in the late 90s and the early 2000s when they were dead and nobody was buying them, I saw that as a real sort of, of course in America in many ways, it was a kind of 1941 moment, but particularly for comics, it was a kind of 1941 moment. And I've been sort of paying attention ever since. We've seen the movies escalate. We've seen the whole thing of superheroes just become crazy popular in a way that hasn't happened since, like we're talking about, since the early 60s. And hence the reason for the whole panel. Because, you know, it suddenly taps into everybody. The little kids want to see the Avengers, and then the grown-ups want to see the Avengers. And again, we want to believe that we can overcome these things. We want to believe that we can overcome the evil government, the alien invasion, whatever it might be. And if we can read about it, then we can believe it in our own lives too.
I mean, we always, I think, human nature always aspires to do more, to be better, to do the right thing, to, I don't know, find the answers when there's no answers to be readily found, pursuing what we can, surviving. I think 9/11 is a really interesting time period for comics, for our country, for everybody, for the world, and in particular for comics, because it was a time when we all felt threatened, we all felt vulnerable, and we needed to find something bigger than us to save us, to secure us, to make us feel okay, to make us feel safe. And what better thing to do than to turn to your superheroes who've been around for, at the time, 70 some years. Say, hey, Spidey, what would you do in this situation? Superman, what would you do in this situation? And what do they do in those comics? They gave salutes to all the, you know, firefighters and the policemen, the real heroes of 9/11. They kind of took a step back and be like, it's not us that you should be thinking about. It's the real life superheroes that are out there.
Be the hero in your own life.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a full circle thing. That's really neat. No, that's really true. And, well, we did mention our visual aids. Here's a great shot of Wonder Woman from back in the day. Again, sort of idealized. Yeah, you can kick butt. You can do whatever you want to do. We want to believe that we can be these heroes. I think that's a big part of what keeps drawing us in time after time. See if we've gotten any questions from our live studio audience before I flip this and sort of ask the other question. I'll let people tune in and send in their questions. One thing that I've found interesting and terrifying is the ways that comics have become true. As I look at, you mentioned Batman comics, and you look at the golden age and you look at the masked villains and you look at these serial killers and whatnot, and they were just fiction and they were crazy. And as time has gone on, these sorts of things have become more and more realistic. And in modern times, you know, in the 60s, Hydra was just a thing. And these days, terrorist organizations not affiliated with countries and out there doing their own thing and blowing stuff up for their own reasons is a very real thing. And so sort of to flip the script a little bit, it scares me. You know, we read these comics to see these idealized versions, to see idealized versions of ourselves overcoming the struggles of society. But it's scary when we see these struggles of society coming into our real world, because we don't have superheroes to defend from that. And like I say, Hydra and different things are such a great example. People have often joked that Stan Lee has created far too many bad things in the world, like evil AI and all this stuff that certainly existed before Stan, but none of us read anything before Stan. But
let's back up and talk about the correlation of wartime and the surgence of comic sales. So you mentioned you've got some notes about World War II, and definitely in Vietnam era, there's also a surge in comics as well.
Well, what I like about what is interesting in 40s and 50s comics is this idea of fear of invasion. Pearl Harbor comes in 1941, and to obviously a considerably lesser extent, you get something like Roswell and the UFO explosion in the late 40s, and you have this idea of fear of invasion, and that inundates comics for a long time, with war comics and with sci-fi books of monster invasions and different things, and it's an interesting time of seeing how people perceive the world and seeing the kinds of things that come up. EC Comics is the most popular, well-known of the time for doing Tales from the Crypt and things like that. And it's this interesting, you know, the 1950s are thought of as such an idyllic time and everything is so perfect. But if you actually lived in those times, you knew it was very, very different. And again, I think comic sales elevate during that time because there's so much fear going on. There's so much fear of invasion, fear of communism, fear of crime, fear of the unknown in race relations and classism and so many things. And so again, you have this escapism of people wanting to get away from the reality of that, but still trying to look for some understanding. And I think the 60s are definitely that, again, with radiation and different things. Captain America stops being, well, Cap becomes the theme in a lot of what we're talking about, where in the 70s he stopped, here he is, right here, my main man, Captain America. In the 70s, during the Watergate thing, he stops being Captain America. Today he's part of Hydra. And so again, I think he reflects both what we see in society, what we fear in society, fear in ourselves. And again, as these things happen, 2017, government goes awry, everybody starts reading comics again.
I think it's interesting to kind of take a step back and look at a society and what are the things that a society entertains themselves with? Like, what do they surround themselves with? What are people watching? What are people reading? And that's a really telltale sign of what's going on in this society. So right now it's 2017 and Wonder Woman just came out, Spider-Man just came out. We've had a string of awesome Marvel movies for the last, I don't know, 10 years now. Avengers, 10,
15 years.
Fantastic Four. Like, what is it just about the most recent, 10 years that has made the superheroes so prevalent? Is it just because there was a really good movie made out, or is there something about our society that was yearning it was the right time for a superhero movie?
I think that's what it is. I think, as we said, these days reflect of what we saw in the mid-20th century. There's a lot of fear going on, and with enough fear to go around, there's a hero fighting that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, part of why we see the prevalence. even to the extent of like Logan, where now we're fearing old age and other things too. And so we see the superhero, our man Logan, taken out by life itself, and that's, you know, something that's on our mind too. But like I say, I think the times we're in right now, probably since 2001, and only escalating ever since, are a lot like they were in the golden age in 1941 when all this started in the first place.
Well, and to tail on that, superheroes aren't a new thing with comics. Like the idea of a hero has been around for as long as human beings have been around. So if you think about, you know, Greek mythology, there's always this idea of like Hercules, of Zeus, of these higher powers that had controlled nature and were kind of somehow better than humans, and something that humans were aspire and look to and look towards. So it's something I think about human culture. I think the superhero is just the kind of 20th, 21st century version of that. But there's something about the human nature that always looks beyond themselves towards something greater.
It's interesting you mention that. I've given a little thought to that about superheroes versus, as you say, heroes prior to that. But I was thinking particularly about pulp figures like the Spirit, Doc Savage. What makes superheroes different? What makes comic books different from the pulps? Why does that change in the golden age? Why have we clung to Superman and to Batman for 75 years, but some of these other really strong characters that came before didn't hold up? And what I kept coming back to was a lot of what we're talking about. And again, I think Peter Parker reflects this probably better than anybody, is that human element. Is that in most comics, even in the case of Superman, where he's the alien, they give you enough backstory. Superman is also Clark Kent. Batman is cool and has all the gadgets, all these things. But at the end of the day, he's this guy that saw his parents get murdered. There's always this relatability to the human factor. When you read the pulps, they really didn't go that deep. You didn't know who Sherlock Holmes was when he wasn't solving crime. Well, you kind of did, but maybe that's not the best example. But generally speaking, they didn't have secret identities. They didn't have a human side. Doc Savage was Doc Savage all the time. And he was the man of bronze all the time. And you didn't care who his dad was or how he got like this. It was Doc Savage and he was having adventures. But with superheroes, the human side is important. The human connection is important. Peter Parker was just a guy until this happened to him. Superman has all these powers, but he still has to go to work every day. Well, he doesn't have to go to work, but he shows up as Clark Kent every day. And like I say, I think it's that relatability, that human factor that makes it different. Certainly in the case of the X-Men, that's true. I think the relatability of the X-Men has always been that they're outcasts, that they're not part of society, and most of their readership feels like they're not part of society either.
Well, and that's, I think, part of the magic of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby was, yes, these are superheroes. Yes, they have capes. Yes, they have superpowers, but they're human. They're relatable. Like, you can understand the struggles of a geeky, nerdy teenager, Peter Parker, who's really smart but can't get a date with a girl. Like, you can understand the struggles of whether you're a different class system or race system or whatever. You can understand what a mutant goes through trying to, kind of be in the human world, yet having all these extraordinary things and being, having prejudice against them for being different. A lot of comics were created by Jewish artists in World War II times. They didn't have a lot of job opportunities. And with, Hitler doing what he was doing in World War II, Jews were prosecuted. And so what could the Jews do in that point in time but create something bigger and better to showcase what it really means to be an idealized human?
That's also very important. One thing that I think, again, separates comics and superheroes particularly from other forms of entertainment, from other kinds of things, is that there's always a struggle. There's always something to be overcome, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But whether it's Galactus or the Nazis or whatever have you, there's something versus something. And I understand that man versus man, man versus society is that's literature and that's all these things. But in other genres, when you read books, it isn't always about the characters. Sometimes it's just about the event. Or when you see a movie, the same kind of thing. It can be more about the invasion than about the characters per se. Maybe Rogue One was a great example of that. It's a story with characters, but you know what's going to happen to all of them. But in with comics, even again within genre, but in comics, in the war comics and in the sci-fi and in the horror, it's always a person. There's always somebody that this is happening to, and they, as you said in the beginning, they're not just gonna die. These people aren't just gonna get shot by. They're not willing to just be shot by Martians. They're gonna get out there with a stick with a nail in it and fight Martians. Whatever it might be, there's always a struggle to be overcome. Again, a lot of people find Superman unrelatable, but at the end of the day, he's still an immigrant. He still has to live on this planet. With all these powers and all these things, he has to still interact with people. Captain America, the man out of time, he's a 1940s guy. Now it's the 21st century, and how is he going to adapt to this? And again, in comics, it's always about a person or a group of people trying to survive some sort of situation. And that makes it fun for the reader, again, because it makes it immediately relatable. And again, I think sort of different from a lot of other things, forms of entertainment, books and movies and whatnot.
And I think since, a lot of these characters have survived and surpassed the 70-year mark, a lot of it is a testimony to just really great storytelling. Fantastic origin stories. Again, we're talking about relatable characters, but if it was kind of a one-note or a one-sided character, we wouldn't be talking about them anymore.
That's right.
And we're talking 75 years, Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman. I don't know how Fantastic Four.
1961, well over 50.
I mean, and we're still talking about them, and we still find new ways of rediscovering those characters in modern times.
Spider-Man right now in theaters right now. High school Spider-Man is one of the most popular things in the country. To an old guy like me, Spider-Man hasn't been in high school in 50 years. But here we are with a brand new Flash Thompson and all these kinds of things. And again, I think it's a testament to what we're talking about, that the roots of these stories, the situations change, the little details change, but the core of these things are the core of the stories, and the core of our need for these stories doesn't really change.
Do you think there's ever going to be a time when we don't need superheroes?
No. And I'll say why, and that's not at all a negative thing. In a perfect world, because I'm a sci-fi fan and because I'm a Superman fan, this is what I believe, there's always another dream. There's always something we can't do that we need Superman for, always. So
I don't know.
He can get us to Mars. Superman, we're not on Mars yet. So
Elon's pretty close.
He's close. Elon Musk is as close to a superhero, I guess, as we get, or at least as close to a Tony Stark as we get.
I think it's just human nature. I think we always, again, want to be better, aspire to things that are beyond our own capabilities. And it's important. It's important for human evolution to think that we can do things beyond our box that we put ourselves in. If we can relate to some of these superheroes, and when we are pushed, as we ultimately will be in our lifetimes, pushed to the edge, we have to think back to what would our favorite superhero do?
Yeah.
And do we live up to that? Do we stand up to being able to hold our badge of honor and say, yeah, I did the right thing. When push comes to shove and had a choice to make, I did the right thing.
Yep. I got Aunt May her pills. I beat the Nazis. That's how you want it to be.
All right, so let's see if we've got any questions here.
We have solved all the mysteries of superheroes and society.
Done.
So that about wraps up panel 3 for our panel day, day 4 of the Black Hat Comics Rocket Milpitas pre-Comic-Con, Comic-Con.
Good job, Kazi.
Thank you. Good job to you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it fun-formational, as I like to say in our newsletter. If you're here local, we've got just a few hours left on our big toy sale today. All toys, statues, pop figures that everybody loves so much, 25% off. So make sure you get down and take advantage of that. Make sure you come down tomorrow for the big swap meet, for the big back issue sale. All back issues 75% off tomorrow. So get to the back parking lot with your Black Cat bucks and take advantage of everybody's cool stuff back there. Hit the back issue bin at 75% off. It's the last day of the pre-Comic-Con, Comic-Con, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Then next Wednesday, look for us next Wednesday to Sunday as we're down at the big show, San Diego Comic-Con, bringing you all the fun information from the biggest show on earth.
That's great. I think that's a wrap. Thanks for watching.